Hello, can you hear me? Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Just have to say first, thank you for that acknowledgement, and the cover and Renetta's feature, as well as many other women of color who are featured in that, is a monumental moment in time. And I am floored and honored and thrilled, and also just have to say that I've been one of those individuals who has been able to be in agencies where I could always see a future version of myself. And I'm on stage with women who also represent a future version of me. And so I just want to say thank you to join us on this panel.
Cool. Thank you.
So to get started, the panel is titled, Why Diverse Leadership Matters? And I want to ease any anxiety in the crowd and just say the quick answer is just because it does. We've seen studies, we've read things, we know there are case studies that give you all the context and the meaning as to why. And so this conversation is one of what happens with representation, and what happens when people can see a future version of themselves, what happens when as a leader you can look and find the next you. And so we're just setting the context around representation being the discussion. So with that, I do want to share just for, I don't know if I clicked the right button here, but just for some additional context as to why the conversation on representation is important, and also where there's a reflection in leadership that changes the dynamic. And so data informs us. So there's just a little bit of data on this slide for you guys to see that as an industry, the overall gain and growth from an overall female perspective has been there. We have disparity when it comes to the racial makeup of women in the industry. We also know from the client side, with ANA reporting through their membership, the composition of the CMO role, that 45% of CMOs are female and 13% are of color. And so again, it's just that notion we've said for many years, you have to see it to be it. If I was someone who could always see a future version of myself and I'm here now, what happens when representation shows up? So that's the conversation. All right, so I want to ask you all this question. I was at a dinner recently and someone asked me this and I struggled with the answer, and I'm curious to hear yours. The question was around your leadership quotient. Do you define yourself as a leader? Do you find yourself as a female leader or something else?
Wow. So I'll start. I've started defining myself as an intentional leader, meaning one who looks at the choices and activities that I'm engaged in with through very specific lens. So tied to values, tied to certain outcomes, tied to what I think is right. And it's intentional, and that's different than authoritarian or innovative leader, but it means that there's purpose or intent behind what I do.
I would say for me, I never defined myself as a female leader. I was always very, very conscious growing up in creative departments that I was very often the only female in creative departments, but as I rose up in management and leadership, I just saw myself as a leader, and if anything, a creative leader in the way I approach management and problem solving, and the empathy and vulnerability that comes from understanding creative people and getting kind of the alchemy and the magic of creativity out of different kinds of people. But I just kind of always was just a leader. I like the word intentional, but I just kind of always considered myself a leader or a creative leader.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Denise?
Great. To be honest, I never identified myself with that identity. Years ago, I would be asked to, jump in on a creative review, to be asked, what does a female think about this campaign? Would you relate to that? Would you buy that? Or be put into pitches because the casting, it was intentional to try and represent a more balanced sort of executive team for a prospective client. But that really just motivated me to do better and to be better than just a token. And along the way, I've met a lot of other female colleagues and mentors who have had an incredible impact on me from a deep friendship and a supportive friendship. So today, I see myself as a human leader. Because if you're not operating at that level, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're probably on the menu, And, the traits that we talk about, which are effective leaders, like collaboration and empowerment and, emotional, aren't uniquely male or female. In fact, what we're talking about is human behavior. So to strive to be as human and as emotive and as aspirational as a lot of the brands we try and bring to life is sort of how I see it now.
I love that human aspect to leadership. So what impact do you believe that your representation has on leadership? And in your agency, in the capacity that you're all serving, you're in different roles and different disciplines. So what impact does your specific representation have?
I'll go with that one first.
Yeah.
Again, because I feel like creative departments have been, at least from my experience, the slowest moving group in agencies for representation. I feel that I didn't realize the impact I had until, I think I said this at another conference, until I just kind of looked up. As a female working really hard and trying to just keep moving through a creative department and moving up, I just kept looking down, and I had a family and I was trying to juggle everything. And then one moment, I had this moment where I kind of looked up and I thought, oh my gosh, not only can I make an impact, but I started getting a lot of feedback that just the fact that I was in the position that I was in was changing people's lives, and they were able to see a path for themselves that they had never seen. And I was so moved at my own impact that I had never even realized for a long time that I had that. It is incredibly powerful for people to see what they could become, and particularly for leadership in creative departments. There hasn't been a lot of females there, and I'm very heartened that there are more. But it's nice to know that that can change people's lives. So.
I don't know that mine is functionally oriented. I grew up in an era where it was not uncommon for me, someone like me who grew up where I did, to be the only, which means that you're experiencing exclusion quite frequently, like Karen was talking about, as a female creative, or even coming into the role of media. It was not uncommon. And so I think what happens is if you have enough of that experience of being excluded, that it sort of motivates you to include others.
I agree.
Because, at least in my frame, I actually don't want anybody to have to go through that kind of experience where you have to figure it out on your own, or second guess yourself, or have any of the other sort of downsides. So I think mine just comes from a deep remembering of what it means to be excluded and trying to make sure that nobody else has to go through that.
I can relate to a lot of what Karen talks about in terms of that work-life blend, and all of a sudden you find yourself in this position of leadership. I joined Midnight Oil about 3 months ago as the first non-family member president. And before that, I spent 5 years as the president of a 102-year-old agency, as the first female president in over 100 years, and the first Asian president. And while that is, has been an incredible privilege, it comes with a lot of responsibility. So I look at that, and I have done a lot of reflection back on my career. And, I've had great CEOs. I've had ones that were awful, and I learned equally as much from both of them. But somehow, it was worse when I was working for a CEO who was female, who wasn't great. I think it was because I was striving so much to be inspired and for that mentorship. And so, I love what I do, and I take it seriously. So it gives, I guess it gives us the opportunity, it gives me the opportunity to do things like paying it forward, taking a look at succession planning and encouraging people to speak up, making sure that there's an environment where people can do that. And there's no dumb questions. There's a lot of discussions that we have at the agency about embracing the discomfort, and that because we're in an ideas business, there are no bad ideas, and that needs to come from all levels of the organization.
Right. So speaking of succession planning, as leaders, you all are in roles too where you're always looking for the bench, right? You have a bench, whether it's across your agency or specifically for a role. So can you talk a little bit about like finding the next you? What are those things? What are you doing? What are you doing actively to develop that bench? And how is that showing up through mentorship as well for you?
I'll go again. It might be unique in creative departments, and it might not be, but I think one of the things I observed as I grew up in creative departments that held women back was there were certain creatives, and often they were men because there's just more of them, that lit up a room when they presented, and they were able to take a client call and convince the client of whatever they needed to convince the client of, and those people generally got asked to the next meeting, and their promotion track may have been a little bit more accelerated. What I have observed happens less frequently, but still happens, is when there is somebody that is a little bit more gregarious, a little bit good more at presenting, the quieter people in the room don't have a voice. What I actively try to do, because I think what Renetta brought up is so essential, is understanding what it feels like to be excluded creates so much more awareness for you in the presentation room, at the table, for the people that aren't speaking up. And there's a variety of reasons they might not be speaking up. But the minute they speak up, the minute they have a chance to speak to the client, the minute they can go to the meeting, the minute they can present in front of the agency, you're creating opportunities for those people to move forward. If you hadn't noticed that they had been quiet, they would have just sort of sat there. So I think awareness, and then actively finding roles for those people to be present and be on those calls, and then to be active in mentoring and making sure you're communicating with your team consistently. Not everybody wants management track. Some people do. And if they do, being very clear on what things they need to work on to get there. You can't just assume that people understand what it takes to be a leader. And if you're really clear about the things that are expected and the things that they could work on, then they can kind of have that path. And then regular check-ins, so people know that you're looking after them and you got their back and you're supporting them. And I think those two things have been kind of the most powerful thing, to just kind of make sure that there's enough people behind me that can fill my role.
Yeah, so I agree with what Karen says. As I think about the mentorship that I do, I'm actively trying to transfer knowledge. And the knowledge I'm trying to transfer is around, well, if you're in this situation, here's what it might mean. Here's some options that you might have, et cetera. Because I think for people who are somewhat on the outside of the conversation, one of the first barriers is you have to take that risk to get in the conversation. So the more I can describe of what it's like, the less risky it becomes. So in a funny way, I'm doing risk management for them. And to echo something Karen said, I think the other thing I do with the people that I mentor is I let them know that I have their back. That something may go wrong, they still may make a misstep, however that goes, but even in that situation, I'm going to be there in their corner to help them navigate or negotiate back out of it.
So Renetta, you're in a new role now.
Yep.
And the role is one I find really interesting, in that it's a lever that we haven't really seen pulled in the industry quite yet. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about what that is and the impact that you hope the role will have.
Okay. So Publicis Groupe has asked me to be the Chief Inclusion Experience Officer globally, which means my role is to work with senior leaders, and I'm going to give a shout out to my girl, Andrea Diaz over there, who's one of our spectacular female leaders, but I get to work with her. Yes. I get to work with her and others to figure out how the organization that she's building and leading, how it can have the display of diversity and inclusion that she thinks is viable. It's also working with our top client leaders, so on our biggest clients, trying to help embed it from a representation standpoint, as well as how the work gets done and where in the work process bias or lack of representation may show up. And what I think is most interesting about it, and I'll just sort of tee it up and it'll probably come back to me though, is that I think from this role, we can begin to look at all the systemic ways that diversity and inclusion don't get embedded, or some of the barriers that appear from inside of the structures or processes that we have. So I'm hoping to be able to take a look at those as well.
Good. And with Time's Up advertising, you know, you all are part of the signatories on that effort and that movement. Can you give some perspective on what that movement has meant to you and what you're hoping we can gain from it?
Sure. I think for us, the key takeaway of that movement was evolving everything from discussion and awareness to action. I mean, that really is a really important focus for us. You know, and recently, related to that, you know, the agency celebrated International Women's Day and today's Equal Pay Day, and so we celebrate all that on social media, which is great. But we encourage the team members to really focus on action. You know, one interesting stat that I heard the other day is that the day Me Too launched, there were 12 million hashtags within the first 24 hours on Facebook. And if you look at that and people were hashtagging a contagious disease, people wouldn't be debating or talking about awareness. They would focus on finding a solution immediately. And I think when you take a look at gender pay gaps that are projected to take another 100 years before that catches up, it is absolutely a crisis. So we have to focus on action. The second thing we do, you know, from a Time's Up, and it's a great community, you know, we often say it takes a village to do most things, and I think that's just as true of what we're trying to do in terms of Time's Up and that movement and supporting each other. And a lot of that is about communication and sharing. And so when we see great, you know, things that are being done in the community, Accenture just recently did a great video, Inclusion Starts with I. We share that, you know, we share that amongst ourselves so that we're making everyone aware of that and driving that action. And I think the last thing is just to go deeper. You know, we have a fairly balanced executive team at the agency, but it's that next level down that is really important to help get them empowered and acting on behalf of the strategic initiatives that we've set out. So, you know, whether that's task forces or an operational team, we're focused on doing something now, you know.
Yeah, I was super inspired by that group when it first started getting together, because I think, as Denise said, the intent was women that actually had the power to create policy at their agencies. I think lots of people would sign up to say, hey, I support what you're talking about, but it is about action, and it's about people that have the power to make those actions, put those into place. So I was very inspired by the collaboration. Sometimes it was messy. there was lots of back and forth and email chains and phone calls, but I think the spirit of that collaboration and everybody sharing the stories. For instance, somebody would say, well, in my agency, a lot of the men are talking about this, and a lot of the other, you know, and we would share stories and how we might solve certain things together. And that was really invigorating, that a lot of competing agencies and the leaders of those agencies would be coming together to solve a much bigger problem for our industry. I found that really inspiring to be a part of. Yeah. And I'm very optimistic at what we can do together.
It's also very public, you know, so something magical and scary happens when you've signed up in public, you know, to say that you're committing to these measurable goals. And so all of a sudden, when you circle around and you measure yourself and hold each other accountable, you know, you better do it. So it's a great motivator.
So inclusivity is a big word in some ways, and we talk a lot about kind of this diversifying of workforce, which is, you know, pipelining for the right talent, and mixing things up from a racial perspective, a gender perspective, inclusivity, making sure that those who have been excluded are a part of the fabric and feel like there's a sense of belonging. But we're in this discourse because of the heightened sense of I think some ethical issues and also some unlawful behaviors. And there are many who are afraid to engage. and don't know how to engage appropriately, tactfully, professionally, or just even empathetically. And so I'm curious, particularly for men, and those who, I'm sure you all have a number of men on your teams as well and in your agencies. So how do you join forces and sort of unite men in a conversation that's about diversity and inclusion? And what are you experiencing as some of the tension that might live there, or opportunity if you've had success?
Well, I'll take a baby. I'll take the first baby step
And then I'll
on
build
this.
on
Okay, cool. Part of it is recognizing that there are men who are allies who want the same thing that we want. And they may want it for different reasons. They may want it because we want it that way, or they may want it for their daughters. And so when I was inside Leo Burnett, there was a task force formed back last fall to try to get at what are the behaviors that are problematic and what are the behaviors that the agency wants to promote. And it was a group of women who pulled this together, and eventually this group one day says, we need to go get some men. And so now there are actually men on this committee, and they were invited, and they contribute, and they are the signals that this is important to a broad audience within the agency. So I think in some ways, it's about us defining the issue and then going to find those people who we know are supporters or allies or kindred spirits on it, and inviting them in and letting them share their voice on the topic.
Yeah, I'll build on that. Again, creative departments are such a unique sort of microcosm in agencies. They're ground zero for the worst behavior in our industry very often, but they're also sort of ground zero for some of the most empathetic people, because that's kind of where creativity comes from. So my personal experience at the Martin Agency has been a unique one, because that agency was a bit of ground zero for this Me Too movement in advertising. And it is an agency built on people that have raised their families in this community, so there's people that stay there for a very long time. And when this happened in the agency, like so many of the men were horrified and didn't know how to act, and I found that their reactions, and they would be writing letters and writing poems, and it was so moving. They wanted to do something, and they were asking, how can I help? And I feel like that's one of the biggest things. It's like, all you need to do is ask how I can help, and that shows that you're interested in just listening and being empathetic and just sitting across the table and hearing what other people have to say. And I think that our tables have been filled, at least at the agency, with men that want to be a part of it. And I think it's just about giving them a voice to say what they want to say, and letting those uncomfortable and honest conversations happen with a group of people. The other thing that we've done in the creative department, but we kind of did agency-wide, is we have like a fun, lightweight word that we say if somebody says something uncomfortable, so we don't have to be buzzkills, but we can be like, hold on, that was, offensive. We just say, ouch. And it's a way that people that have said, I don't know what to say anymore, I feel like I can't comment on somebody's work because I think they'll be offended or they're going to take this the wrong way, and we just create a little bit of an environment that allows people to say, hey, what you just said isn't cool, but let's all just kind of work through this, as opposed to making it a big, like, oh, you hurt my feelings. And there's that, but then I think there's both spectrums, and we've been trying to create that balance in the agency too, so everybody feels like they can speak up, but it doesn't have to be super heavy. It can be lightweight, but it can be heavy if it needs to be. So those are the things that we actively every day try to foster, and I feel like the men have felt very included in that process.
Good.
So far.
I think inclusion activities and initiatives are very important, and having days devoted to that are very important. But we shouldn't need to do that. So in the future, not having to have that, I think, would be a goal. And at the heart of it, inclusion is not going to work if we push it so far that it becomes exclusive, right? Yep. So I think, to Renetta's point, finding the people within the agency, within the communities who see the benefits for everybody, not just for those in those specific groups, is really important. And also making a lot of noise about great actions, right? So celebrate people who speak up, celebrate people who do the right thing. You know, when you see that, that starts to be a cultural shift at the agency, then it's pretty powerful.
I think there are a couple other things. One, so when the Time's Up advertising initiative came to Leo Burnett, and one of our chief creative officers, a woman named Judy John, was instrumental in that, and she's a fantastic leader in our Toronto office. When it came to the agency, first thing, it went to the CEO, who's a gentleman, Andrew Swinan. He said, I'm 100% behind this, sent that message out to women, get signatories, they're fine. And then what he said is, I want to call a town hall, which is an agency-wide meeting, to get people to come and talk about this topic. And so the task force that I mentioned presented at this town hall. And what one of the devices people used was to take the Time's Up letter and put it in the back of the room and ask the people who had attended this meeting to sign it, even though it was never going to go back to the committee or anything like that. And the room could hold 400 people. By the time the meeting was over, we had probably 200 letters. And if you think about it, the original signatories are 180. And so, and that points to the importance the CEO put on it, but it also was the importance of relationships and peer relationships. So a lot of men in that room were signing that letter because they wanted to show their support for women. So it's back to some of the stuff Karen was saying. It's back to what Denise is referring to. There are ways to get it done, because I think people do want to create better environments,
I think they
or
do.
more creative environments, and that's one of the ways they can show that commitment.
Allies are, in the word allyship is one that I've enjoyed finding more meaning in over my career, because there have been many times where I haven't realized along the way that, oh, that was an ally, you know, and whether it was someone who was a manager or on another team who just looked out, but those are people who are just, as they say in education, look for helpers. You know, and allyship, I believe, is that spirit of, I'm here to help, but it's also a very active commitment to say, I'm participating, I'm paving the way, letting you have the runway, but I'm participating and actively in it with you. I would describe one of my prior management teams, the relationship we had as, I reported to a group of people who would stand in front of me, stand beside me, and stand behind me. And I feel that allyship, true allyship, sort of surrounds you that way. Yeah. And so I appreciate you guys sharing that in your perspectives on your agencies. We are going to take some questions, I believe, from the audience. So audience, if you're ready with anything you want to know from these women here, feel free to use the app.
Keesha, I'm the only one that asked the question.
Oh.
I get to choose.
There you go.
But I have it open, so feel free to throw some new ones in. First question for you, Renetta, if I may.
Okay.
You're in a fairly new global role.
Yeah.
What are the special challenges that you have understanding what inclusion means in what I'll call foreign cultures, in overseas markets, where it's very different? Either that culture is on a different path in terms of equity and inclusion, or you just might not understand what it means there.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to admit, I may not understand. So I'm 2 weeks into this role, so I'm sure there's, a whole ton of stuff I don't understand. But what I do understand is that in different cultures, and let's call them societal cultures, there are definitions of inclusion, whether it's caste systems, whether it's economic systems, whether it's gender systems. There are those systems. They have been documented in some way, and I think that that's knowable. But there's also our internal systems where we still have leaders who are trying to create something inside of their agencies, and I think, not having had to deal with it yet, they would be my first call. What goes on in your market? What would make a difference? How are your clients responding to this? How are your clients looking at this? And what are the ways that we can increase inclusion while being respectful of the society and world you live in?
So your first job is to listen.
Yes.
Karen,
Absolutely.
I have a question for you. And you referenced the Martin Agency's recent ordeal. The underrepresented often need to work even harder to prove that they're not there because of a particular gender or race. Is that particularly true for you, given your ascension into that position, given what Martin has gone through? What is that like?
It's a great question, and I think actually both Kristen Cavallo and I talk about that very same thing. I'm certain that I probably did get the position because I'm a woman, but I think how I've always looked at it is I know that I'm qualified, I know that I'm great at my job, I know I probably could have had this role 10 years ago had I chosen it. Circumstances catapulted me into this position, and I'm going to take it. I'm going to create the opportunity to make a positive change in the industry. But there's no doubt that the optics of that were part of kind of what that swift decision was. But I'm not going to waste that opportunity.
Fantastic. Denise, what are the unique challenges of coming into a family-owned company?
It's the balance ultimately of all of the wonderful things that make a family company great. The warmth and the I've got your back attitude, and everyone absolutely has that, and there's a pride in coming and being a part of something, into then being a very professional organization, and that means making tough calls, and sometimes that means, despite relationships that you've cultivated carefully over the years, you've got to make a business decision, and it's the balance of the two.
Keesha, here's a great question from Courtney. How do we avoid making inclusion just an obligation?
Wow. Well, you have to measure. I think when you're in a state of obligation, there's a disconnect probably in values and how your values show up in your behaviors and actions. And so that's a big question, one, but my instinct is to say you have to find measures and monitor progress in qualitative ways, which is behavioral, as well as quantitative ways, which is how numbers shift. And if you're not seeing a holistic shift in workforce across levels and representation and leadership, all of that as far as a total makeup of your agency, then you're only operating out of obligation. Because talent shows up, we know this, and thank you for being so confident in saying what you just said, which is you deserve the job that you're in, but we know that talent shows up in multiple ways. So obligation, if you're acting out of obligation, your numbers in some ways would reflect it because you wouldn't be able to sustain.
Right.
I think if I may add to that.
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
I want to add to that one too.
You know, a lot of what we're talking about is not a checklist, it's not a quota, and the things that we're talking about are fundamental, things like safety and security, and I mean, these are human rights things, you know, not just a business practice. And we're in a global economy, and we know that a lot of our clients have asked us to make sure that we've got the right mix, you know, in our departments and whatnot. But if you take a look at the core of what it is, which is a human people business, it goes back to doing what's right for people, and that is absolutely diversity and inclusion.
And my ad is, if you look at our agencies as systems, inside of any system, there's going to be sort of planned activities and occurrences, much like Keesha was talking about. But in systems, there's always something that's emergent. Something pops up. Something gets created over there that gets introduced into the system. So if you can't find anything emergent in your culture around the issue of inclusivity, you're probably just in the obligation zone, right?
Yep.
Because you're not giving it room to emerge.
Quick lightning round.
Yes.
Question from the audience. 10 seconds of advice for a young woman starting in the industry.
I would say just always speak your truth and do it confidently and do it often.
Take a risk. Don't be afraid. Take risks.
I'll go back to the ally thing. Find your helper.
Yeah. And a pivot off of that is find a mentor, find a guide, Sherpa.
They're out there.
They're out there.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.